I was having coffee with my friend Helen last Tuesday morning. She's 72, sharp as a tack, still drives herself to her book club every week. And she said something that really got me thinking. She looked at me over her coffee cup and said, "I wish someone had told me what to really watch for when my husband started changing. The doctors kept saying everything was normal for his age, but I knew something wasn't right." That conversation has been on my mind ever since, because Helen's absolutely right. There are changes that happen as we get older that everyone just brushes off as normal aging. But the truth is, some of these changes are actually warning signs that deserve our attention. Not panic, not fear, but real caring attention. If you're over 70, or if you love someone who is, I want to have an honest conversation with you today. We're going to talk about 7 warning signs that too many people ignore or dismiss. Signs that could make a real difference if we catch them early. This isn't about scaring anyone. It's about loving each other well enough to pay attention to what matters. Let me start by saying something important. Getting older doesn't mean you have to accept feeling terrible or watching your loved ones decline without understanding what's happening. Yes, our bodies change as we age, and that's completely natural. But there's a big difference between normal aging and warning signs that something needs attention. I think about my neighbor, Frank, who's 74, and used to be the guy everyone called when they needed help with home repairs. Frank knew everything about plumbing, electrical work, you name it. But over the past year, his wife Nancy started noticing that Frank would get confused in the middle of projects he'd done 100 times before. He'd start wiring a light switch and then stop, looking lost, unable to remember what came next. Nancy mentioned this to their doctor during Frank's annual checkup, and the doctor said, "Well, he's getting older. It's normal to slow down a bit." But Nancy knew this was not about slowing down. This was about Frank losing skills he'd had for decades. She pushed for more tests, and it turned out Frank was in the early stages of a condition that, when caught early, could be managed much better than if they'd waited. This is exactly what I'm talking about. There's a difference between moving a little slower or needing reading glasses, and losing abilities or experiencing changes that affect your daily life in significant ways. The problem is, we've gotten so used to dismissing concerns about older adults that we sometimes miss opportunities to help. The first warning sign I want to talk about is something that happened to my friend Dorothy. She's 76, lives alone in the same house she's called home for 40 years, and has always been incredibly social. Dorothy was the one organizing the neighborhood potluck dinners, volunteering at the hospital gift shop, playing bridge with the same group of ladies for 20 years. But her daughter started noticing that Dorothy was declining invitations to things she used to love. At first, it seemed like she was just being more selective about how she spent her time, which is actually pretty normal and healthy as we get older. But then Dorothy stopped going to bridge club altogether, something she'd never missed unless she was seriously ill. When her daughter asked about it, Dorothy said she just didn't feel like going anymore, but the real reason, which came out later, was that Dorothy was struggling to follow the game. She couldn't keep track of the cards that had been played, couldn't remember the bidding system she'd used for years. Instead of asking for help or talking to someone about what was happening, Dorothy just withdrew from activities that had become frustrating or embarrassing. This kind of social withdrawal, especially when it involves giving up activities that someone has always enjoyed and been good at, can be an early warning sign of cognitive changes. It's not just about preferring to stay home more often. That's completely normal. It's about avoiding activities because they've become difficult in ways they never were before. The tricky thing is that people experiencing these changes often become very good at hiding them, even from themselves. They'll make excuses, find reasons to avoid situations that reveal their struggles, or simply stop doing things rather than admit something has changed. Another warning sign that too many people overlook is what I call the little accidents that start happening more frequently. I'm not talking about the occasional bump or bruise. We all have those. I'm talking about a pattern of incidents that suggest balance, coordination, or judgment might be changing in ways that could be dangerous. My friend George, who's 78 and still loves working in his garden, started having what he called clumsy days. He'd trip over the garden hose, bump into door frames, spill his coffee more often than usual. George and his family laughed it off at first. We all get a little less coordinated as we age, right? But then George fell in his bathroom one morning. Nothing serious, just lost his balance getting out of the shower. A week later, he backed his car into his neighbor's mailbox, something he'd never done in 50 years of driving. These weren't random accidents. They were signs that George's spatial awareness and balance were changing in ways that needed attention. The key is recognizing patterns. One fall, one fender bender, one spilled cup of coffee. These things happen to everyone. But when you start seeing multiple incidents, especially involving balance, coordination, or judgment calls, that's information worth paying attention to. What makes this particularly challenging is that many folks over 70 are incredibly independent and proud of their abilities, which is wonderful, but that same independence can make them reluctant to mention these little accidents to their families or doctors. They don't want to worry anyone, and they certainly don't want anyone questioning their ability to live independently. Here's something else that's really important to understand. Some warning signs show up as changes in personality or mood that seem to come out of nowhere. I'm not talking about having bad days or going through difficult periods, which we all experience. I'm talking about significant shifts in how someone typically behaves or responds to situations. Take my friend Ruth, who's 73 and has always been one of the most patient, gentle people you could ever meet. Ruth raised 5 children, worked as an elementary school teacher for 30 years, and was known for her ability to stay calm in any situation. But her family started noticing that Ruth was becoming increasingly irritable and anxious about things that had never bothered her before. She'd get upset about changes in routine, become agitated when plans shifted unexpectedly, or react with unusual anger to minor inconveniences. At first, her family wondered if she was just going through a difficult time or dealing with stress they didn't know about. But these personality changes persisted and seemed to be getting more pronounced. It turned out that Ruth was experiencing early changes that were affecting her ability to process and adapt to situations the way she always had. The irritability and anxiety weren't character flaws or signs that she was becoming a difficult person. They were symptoms of changes happening in her brain that made everyday situations feel more overwhelming than they used to. This is why it's so important to pay attention when someone's basic personality seems to shift dramatically, especially if they become more anxious, agitated, or rigid about routines when they've never been that way before. These changes often happen gradually, which makes them easy to dismiss or attribute to other causes. The thing is, our families know us better than anyone. When someone who loves us says, "You seem different lately," or "This isn't like you," it's worth taking that observation seriously rather than brushing it off. Let me tell you about something that happened with my friend Martha's husband, Jim. Jim is 75, retired from managing a hardware store, and has always been the guy who could fix anything. He's got this workshop in his garage that's perfectly organized, every tool in its place, every nail and screw sorted by size. Jim's been that way for as long as anyone's known him. But Martha started noticing that Jim's workshop was becoming chaotic. Tools weren't getting put back where they belonged. Projects were left half-finished, and Jim seemed to lose track of what he was working on from one day to the next. When Martha mentioned it, Jim got defensive and said he was just busy with multiple projects. What Martha was seeing was actually a warning sign that many people miss. Changes in someone's ability to organize, plan, and follow through on tasks that used to be second nature to them. This isn't about becoming less motivated or interested in hobbies. This is about the brain's executive functions, the abilities that help us plan, organize, and complete tasks, starting to change. For someone like Jim, whose identity was so tied to being capable and organized, these changes were particularly difficult to acknowledge. He could still use his tools, still knew how to fix things, but the part of his brain that helped him plan and execute projects systematically was starting to struggle. The important thing Martha learned was that this kind of change often shows up first in complex activities that require multiple steps and sustained attention. It might be managing finances, following recipes, organizing social events, or in Jim's case, completing workshop projects. The person can still do individual tasks just fine, but stringing together a series of tasks becomes more challenging. Another warning sign that too many families overlook is changes in driving habits. And I want to be really careful about how we talk about this, because driving independence is so important to most of us. I'm not suggesting that everyone over 70 should stop driving. That's absolutely not the case. Most folks in their 70s and 80s are perfectly safe drivers, but there are specific changes in driving behavior that can signal that someone's visual processing, reaction time, or judgment might be changing in ways that deserve attention. My friend Eleanor, who's 71 and still drives herself to her watercolor class every Thursday, started getting confused about routes she'd driven for years. She'd take wrong turns in her own neighborhood or forget where she parked at the grocery store. Eleanor's family noticed she was also becoming much more anxious about driving, avoiding left turns, refusing to drive after dark, or getting nervous in situations that had never bothered her before. These weren't signs that Eleanor should immediately stop driving. They were signs that she might benefit from a driving evaluation or some refresher training. The key is distinguishing between normal caution that comes with experience, like avoiding rush hour traffic or being more careful in bad weather, and new anxieties or confusion about driving situations that used to feel routine. What's particularly challenging about driving changes is that they often happen so gradually that the person experiencing them adapts without realizing how much they've changed their habits. They might start avoiding highways, limiting trips to familiar routes, or only driving during certain times of day. These adaptations can be smart and safe, but they can also mask underlying changes that might affect other areas of life too. Here's another warning sign that breaks my heart because it's so often misunderstood: changes in personal hygiene or appearance that are out of character for someone. I want to be very clear about this. I'm not talking about someone who's always been casual about their appearance, becoming more relaxed about grooming. I'm talking about people who have always taken pride in their appearance, suddenly neglecting basic hygiene, or wearing the same clothes for days at a time. My neighbor Carl, who's 79, was always impeccably dressed. Even for a quick trip to the mailbox, Carl would make sure his shirt was tucked in and his hair was combed. He took pride in his appearance and often got compliments on how well dressed he was. But Carl's son started noticing that his father was wearing the same shirt multiple days in a row. His hair was unkempt, and he seemed to have stopped shaving regularly. When the family brought this up with Carl, he insisted everything was fine and seemed genuinely surprised that anyone had noticed changes. This wasn't about Carl becoming lazy or careless. It was about changes in his brain that affected his awareness of his own appearance and his ability to maintain the routines he'd followed for decades. Changes in personal care can be early indicators of several different conditions, from depression to cognitive changes to physical limitations that make grooming more difficult. The important thing is recognizing when these changes represent a significant departure from someone's usual habits and standards. Sometimes, family members hesitate to bring up concerns about hygiene because it feels invasive or embarrassing. But approaching these conversations with love and concern, rather than criticism, can open the door to understanding what's really happening and getting appropriate help. Let me talk about something else that's often overlooked. Significant changes in sleep patterns that go beyond the normal shifts that can happen as we age. Many folks find that their sleep changes somewhat as they get older, maybe going to bed earlier or waking up more during the night. But there are sleep changes that can be warning signs of other issues. My friend Betty, who's 74, started experiencing what she called mixed-up days and nights. She'd be wide awake at 2 a.m., wandering around her house, and then exhausted during the day. She'd fall asleep in her chair while watching television, then be unable to sleep when bedtime came around. At first, Betty and her family thought this was just insomnia or maybe stress-related sleep problems. But these dramatic disruptions in sleep patterns can actually be early signs of several conditions that affect older adults. Betty's sleep-wake cycle was becoming confused in ways that suggested changes in her brain's internal clock. What made this particularly concerning was that Betty's sleep disruptions were affecting her mood, her appetite, and her ability to think clearly during the day. She was becoming more confused and forgetful, partly because she wasn't getting restorative sleep at night. Sleep pattern changes become warning signs when they're dramatic, persistent, and affecting other areas of someone's life. We're not talking about occasionally having trouble falling asleep or waking up earlier than usual. We're talking about complete disruptions of normal sleep-wake cycles that leave someone feeling disoriented and exhausted. Another area where warning signs often appear is in changes to eating habits and appetite. Again, it's normal for food preferences and appetite to change somewhat as we age, but significant, persistent changes in eating patterns can signal underlying issues that deserve attention. I think about my friend Harold, who's 77 and has always been a man who enjoyed his meals. Harold's wife passed away 2 years ago, and he's been learning to cook for himself, which has actually become a source of pride for him. But Harold's daughter noticed that he was losing weight steadily, and when she'd visit, there often wasn't much food in the house. When she asked Harold about it, he said he just wasn't hungry much anymore, that food didn't taste as good as it used to. Harold wasn't deliberately restricting his eating. He simply wasn't experiencing hunger or finding food appealing the way he always had. Changes in appetite and eating habits can be related to medication side effects, depression, changes in taste and smell, dental problems, or difficulty with the physical aspects of shopping and food preparation. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking. This all sounds scary. How do I know when to be concerned and when something is just normal aging? That's such an important question, and I want to address it head-on because the last thing I want is for anyone to panic or become overly worried about every little change. The difference between normal aging and warning signs often comes down to degree and impact. Normal aging might mean moving a little slower, needing reading glasses, or preferring quieter social gatherings. Warning signs are changes that significantly affect someone's ability to do things they've always done, that impact their safety, or that represent major departures from their usual personality and behavior patterns. Let me share what happened with my friend Alice, who's 73 and has always managed her own finances with incredible precision. Alice balanced her checkbook to the penny every month, never missed a bill payment, and could tell you exactly how much she spent on groceries each week. When they finally sat down together to look at Alice's finances, they discovered she'd been paying some bills multiple times while others had gone unpaid. She'd written checks but forgotten to mail them, or mailed checks without recording them in her register. This wasn't about Alice becoming careless with money. This was about changes in her cognitive abilities that were making it difficult for her to manage the complex multi-step process of handling finances. The key was that Alice's son approached this situation with love and concern rather than judgment. Instead of taking over her finances completely, they worked together to set up systems that would help Alice maintain as much independence as possible while ensuring her bills got paid and her accounts stayed organized. This brings me to something really important. When you notice warning signs in someone you love, how you approach the conversation can make all the difference in the world. Nobody wants to feel like they're being watched for signs of decline, and nobody wants to have their independence questioned or taken away. I learned this lesson from watching my friend Margaret navigate concerns about her husband Robert's driving. Margaret had noticed that Robert was having more difficulty with navigation and seemed less confident behind the wheel. Instead of demanding that he stop driving or going behind his back to talk to their doctor, Margaret suggested they take a defensive driving course together. This approach allowed Robert to maintain his dignity while getting an objective assessment of his driving skills, and it opened the door for conversations about any changes he might be experiencing. The instructor was able to provide helpful feedback and suggestions, and Robert felt supported rather than criticized. Most importantly, Robert remained an active participant in decisions about his own safety and independence. When we approach these conversations with curiosity rather than judgment, with support rather than control, we're much more likely to get honest responses and find solutions that work for everyone involved. Here's something else that's crucial to understand. Many of these warning signs can be addressed or managed when they're caught early, but only if we're paying attention and willing to seek appropriate help. Some changes might be related to medication side effects that can be adjusted. Others might indicate conditions that respond well to treatment when caught in early stages. My friend Dorothy, who I mentioned earlier, ended up working with an occupational therapist who helped her develop strategies for managing the cognitive changes she was experiencing. Dorothy learned techniques for staying organized, tools for maintaining her social connections, and ways to adapt activities she loved so she could continue enjoying them. The important thing was that Dorothy got help while she was still able to learn and implement new strategies rather than waiting until the changes had progressed further. Early intervention made it possible for Dorothy to maintain her independence and quality of life much longer than might have been possible otherwise. This is why I'm so passionate about having these conversations and recognizing these warning signs. It's not about assuming the worst or taking away someone's autonomy. It's about loving people well enough to pay attention and help them get the support they need to live their best lives. If you're recognizing some of these warning signs in yourself, please don't be afraid to talk to someone about what you're experiencing. There's no shame in acknowledging that things might be changing. There's wisdom in it. The people who love you want to support you, not judge you or take over your life. And if you're noticing these signs in someone you love, approach them with the same kindness and respect you'd want to receive. Ask questions instead of making assumptions. Offer support instead of taking control. It can mean adapting, getting support when needed, and making smart choices that allow us to continue living fulfilling lives. But that's only possible when we're willing to pay attention to warning signs and address them with love, wisdom, and appropriate professional help. The 7 warning signs we've talked about: social withdrawal from enjoyed activities, increasing accidents or coordination problems, personality changes, difficulties with organization and planning, changes in driving habits, neglect of personal hygiene and disrupted sleep or eating patterns. These aren't meant to frighten anyone. They're meant to empower you with knowledge that could make a real difference in your life or the life of someone you love. Life after 70 can be rich, meaningful, and independent. But maintaining that independence often requires being honest about changes when they occur and getting appropriate support to address them. Have you noticed any of these warning signs in yourself or someone you love? How did you handle the situation? What advice would you give to others who might be facing similar concerns? Your experiences could be exactly what someone else needs to hear. The goal isn't to live in fear of aging. It's to age with awareness, wisdom, and the support of people who care about us. That's how we honor the incredible lives we've lived and make the most of the precious time we have ahead. Take care of yourselves and take care of each other. We're all in this journey together, and there's strength and wisdom in looking out for one another with love and attention.